Welcome to day 5 of Preemie Power Week. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These educational sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANCE, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring you the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. And I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And right now, we're going to start this day talking about sustaining essential care, preterm newborn challenges within the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization's Sustainable Development Goal 3.2 establishes ending preventable death of newborn and children under the age of 5, with all countries aiming to reduce neonatal mortality and under 5 mortality by 2030. Preventing preterm birth along the life course through preconception and antenatal care is essential, but also providing adequate care and follow-up to those babies born prematurely, sick, or with other adverse conditions. As the world addresses the COVID-19 pandemic, we must safeguard decades of progress on maternal and child health and well-being. The continuity of essential services and funding for reproductive, maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent health must not only be protected from cuts or reallocation as part of national COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, but also prioritized and increased to respond to the immediate and long-term repercussions of the pandemic. And I have here joining me live from Uruguay, Dr. Duran, Dr. Pablo Duran, who is the Regional Advisor on Perinatal Health at the Latin America Center for Perinatology, Pan American Health Organization for the World Health Organization. Dr. Duran is an Associate Professor from the Department of Public Health, University of Buenos Aires. He has more than 25 years of clinical experience as a researcher and expert in epidemiology, monitoring and evaluation of policies and population interventions in maternal, newborn, and child health. He has obtained 4 training scholarships in Argentina and abroad. He has received several awards for his scientific work. He has authored more than 50 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals, and he's the author of more than 15 books and contributor to technical and publication books on pediatric, nutrition, epidemiology, and public health. Dr. Duran, thank you so much for joining us here today. What a pleasure to have you sharing your life experience, your expertise and knowledge. Welcome. You are mute. Maybe you can unmute yourself. Great. Thank you, Dr. Duran.
Thank you very much.
We are so happy to have you. You can share your screen with us.
Yeah.
Dr. Duran has a presentation, and then at the end of his presentation, you're going to have a few minutes for Q&A, and you can send your comments or your questions on the box below the screen.
Can you see the presentation?
Absolutely.
Okay. Again, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you to CPBF, to Fabiana Bacchini, and to all of you. I'm really happy and grateful for sharing with you these thoughts about the sustaining essential care for very small and preterm newborns. We are as it was mentioned, facing perhaps the most serious challenge that we as human beings should face during the last years. But still, providing care to newborns, and especially to preterm and sick newborns, continue to be a challenge. So it is really my pleasure to share with you, mainly to those of you who are committed to providing care as parents, families, and community. And I would like to start thinking with you about the life expectancy. During more than 25 years, the life expectancy has grown in our region. Uh, the last data from 2017, we can see that the life expectancy is for North America around 80 years, with a shorter life expectancy in the region of the Americas and in Latin America and the Caribbean. But the question is if living longer means living healthier. And the issue is that the time around birth, we know that is the most important time in our life. And we know that the time around the delivery and the first date of life are the most challenging, is the most challenging period of time where uh, we can be happy enjoying our babies, but also where we need to provide the adequate care to reduce the risk and the impact. And even when the neonatal mortality and stillbirth has been reduced in the region during the last year, the second condition that we need to consider is if that reduction has or has not been with equity. And we can see in most of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and you can see there on the picture on the left, the gap between the red and the yellow circle express the gap between socioeconomic conditions at households and the risk of adverse outcomes at births. And we can see that the gap in most of the countries, it's important. So it means that those newborns at poorer households are exposed to higher risk to presenting adverse outcomes. And even when along the time this gap has been reduced, it is still being a challenge to reduce these gaps in the countries in the region, but also within the countries. Socioeconomic conditions, uh, living in rural areas, ethnicity, and other conditions that we all know are affecting babies at the time of birth. On the graph on the right, you can see that the same perspective can be seen in terms of accessing specific interventions. Again, we can see that there are important gaps in accessing family planning, prenatal care, accessibility to 4 or more prenatal cares, or uh, delivering with skilled birth attendants. So mothers and family are exposed to inequity in terms of the quality of interventions that we know are important to reducing the impacts. And now we are moving to prematurity, and we can see that again, the risk, the probability of having a preterm baby depends on the socioeconomic conditions. We can see at the global level that between 7.5 or 12.5 is the difference in terms of the prevalence, the proportion of preterm babies between the more developed or the less developed countries. This is the same in Latin America and the Caribbean and North America, but we can see in a different way. While in the Caribbean, the proportion of preterm babies is 6.7%, in North America, it's 10.6%. So we need to think, why are these conditions, why babies are being born prematurely, but also to think which are the risks associated to these conditions. And we know that maternal and perinatal health, inequity, and disabilities are closely associated. You can see the red bars. The red bars, the hard red bar means the maternal and neonatal conditions and nutritional deficiencies that can contribute to disability. We can see the bar on the right that correspond to the low socio-demographic index countries, that in those countries, the contribution of maternal and neonatal conditions that are responsible for disabilities are higher. So if the maternal and neonatal conditions are inadequate at birth, and mainly in populations with low socioeconomic conditions or with low socio-demographic index, they are highly exposed to different disabilities. So the high prevalence of prematurity and inequity are great contributors to inadequate health conditions, growth, and mainly to disabilities that will affect along the life course this baby, his life, his family, and at the end, reducing or increasing the loss of human capital. We can see that as an average, the proportion of prematurity in Latin America and the Caribbean, we said it's around 8 or 9%. We can see on the pyramid on the right that even when at the global level 120 million babies are born at the adequate gestational age at term, we can account for more than 12 million babies that are born between 32nd and 37 weeks of gestation, 1.6 million that are moderate prematures, and around 1 million who are extremely premature babies. These babies are, or these conditions, this prematurity is associated with the presence of moderate or severe long-term disability. So we are talking, when we see regional numbers, when we see what happens in the region of the Americas, that every year 15 million babies are born. From them, more than 140,000 will die before the first month of life. But also, more than 1.2 million of premature babies are being born every year, and this is an enormous number. And from them, just as an example, we can estimate that more than 30,000, and these numbers are every year, so every year 30,000 newborns will probably present moderate or severe complications linked to this prematurity. And for example, around 25,000 newborn will probably present retinopathy of prematurity that will lead to blindness or affection of the vision. So we are talking about serious complications, but this is not all bad. Adequate care based on the needs of every newborn can contribute to reducing the impact on human capital. So we have good news. we have the evidence, and you can see here two technical documents just as an example. The one on the right from the World Health Organization, and the one in the middle, the green one, that we are launching in few weeks in Spanish, but I make the promise that this will be available in English by December, providing clinical guidelines to providing adequate and evidence-based care and follow-up to preterm, small, and sick newborns. And why is important? Because if we implement all these interventions, we will not only, which is not less important, to reduce all these disabilities that I have mentioned rapidly. We know that also implementing those interventions from the prenatal and perinatal period will be able by the year 2030 to reduce around 20,000 stillbirths, around 45,000 neonatal deaths, and more than 50,000 infant deaths. So we're talking about large, really large numbers, and it's not only important about the large numbers. I know that it's important, but it's also important every newborn, every family who has a baby, a premature baby, that received all the care, all the information, and all the interventions that are adequate to prevent these conditions. And how do we need to move in order to address these results and to provide this comprehensive care? The main approach that I would like to highlight is what we call the life course approach. We know that at every stage in our life, there are interventions that need to be implemented and that will have potential and positive impact along the life course. We are talking about preconception, prenatal, delivery, early postnatal, childhood, infancy, youthhood. So we need to identify the link and all the intervention that has to be implemented that involve from family planning and preconception nutrition, because we know that it's important to prevent and reduce infections, nutritional deficiencies that are linked to birth defects, to prematurity, and to other adverse conditions. We also need that routine antenatal care and antenatal nutrition, prevention and diagnosis and treatment of specific infections that are highly prevalent, as for example syphilis or other infections, are still affecting newborns all around the world, and mainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the assessment and management of fetal health and growth, and also maternal complications during pregnancy, at the time of labor and birth. And these interventions will prevent having a preterm baby. So it's really important to promote preconception, prenatal, and perinatal care in order to prevent prematurity. But when prematurity occurs, we also have evidence and technology and knowledge in order to prevent the consequences and the complications associated with prematurity. This is talking about the prevention of specific disease, provided adequate nutrition and care that needs to be continuously supported along the coming years, the childhood and school age. I'm sure that you know about this, but the human brain development, it's not only in one period. It's not that the baby is born with all the brain and all his functions developed. The different pathways, the sensory, language, or higher cognitive functions are developed from conception up to, depending on the function, up to the childhood or adolescence. And providing the adequate care, nutrition, and when I'm talking about care, it's not only medical care or nurse care, it's also love, it's also care, it's also being born and being cared within a family context. Caregivers provided love and adequate care will contribute on improving what you see on the graph on the right. The brain in the newborn needs to continue developing the complexity, the neurons connections that continue mainly up to the 24 months of age. And to contribute on that growth and development, we need to provide adequate environments. During pregnancy, the mother provides this environment, and we need to care this environment, which is the mother, and it means the nutrition, the mental health. We know that violence in the household is an example of a condition that can also affect the baby's growth and the presence of prematurity, and also the environment once the baby is born in the household, receiving adequate health, nutrition, and investing in early childhood in the period of time that we are talking about. It's not only about medical care, as I said, or nurse care. It does not only related to technology, NICUs, etc. We know that investing in early childhood contributes to social and economic development from the rights perspective, because we know that the Convention of the Right of the Child states that the states, the countries, and the society needs to recognize the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and the child's right to development. But also it's related to equity, because every newborn, every child has to receive the same quality of care. But it's also related about economic, and we know that investing in early childhood is cost effective. For example, $1 invested during early childhood has the return of 13 times that can be seen or measured in terms of educability, income, and development along the life course. And the last issue that sustain this important is the impact of the conditions along the life course that we have already mentioned. So within this framework, from the global and international perspective, there are several strategies and approaches as the nurturing care approach that promote these main three objectives, which are survive. We have the commitments, countries have the commitments of achieving ending preventable deaths, maternal, stillbirth, and newborn deaths. Thrive, what means ensuring health and well-being for mothers and newborns, and transforming the environments, expanding, enabling environments. What does not only mean the microenvironment, the family environment, it means the social environment, the physical environment, all the conditions that can contribute positively or negatively to the health and well-being. So the Pan American Health Organization Common Agenda highlights these main issues: promoting health as a main strategy, ensuring appropriate and timely quality health services, but also providing priority to care to vulnerable children and families, including in emergency situations. And at the end, providing a legal instrument to build an integrated system that provides care. Care understood as the nurturing care approach that you can see here, which involves not only medical, physical care, it involves adequate nutrition, It involves responsive caregiving. It involves security and safety, opportunities for early learning, specific for every step in the process of growing and developing, and good health. This comprehensive approach then involves different stakeholders and different actors. It's not only responsibility of the families, it's not only responsibility of the health system. It involves obviously the caregivers as the primary providers of care, but also empower communities. It's not only an individual action, it involves the communities as a whole, and also supportive services. And what services? It's not only about health services, it's social services, it's educational service, it's all the care that is provided by society as an organized society. And finally, enabling policies, legal regulations that make that these interventions are made reality. So, which are the specific stakeholders? All who are part of the society, the multilateral and bilateral organizations, the governments, but also the business community, also the academic and the research institutions, also the philanthropic organizations, the civil society, parents organizations, media, that will advocate and work on promoting safe and positive agriculture, nutrition, labor regulations, finance, health, environmental health, child protection, education, and social protection. So it's a complex network where every person has a role to play. Just as an example, this is an analysis that we have performed around the availability at the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean related to national policies for preventing retinopathy of prematurity, having national guidelines, national legislation, or national data collection and monitoring system. And you can see that each bar, each color of the bars represent one out of these four tools. And you can see that even when some countries have the four, the national policy, the national guideline, the national legislation, and the monitoring system, many countries do not have these four basic tools to promote well-being, to prevent and to treat retinopathy of prematurity. That I'm going back to the beginning, we know that around 25,000 newborns are exposed to this condition. So we need the national commitment, but also the families, the researchers, the health professional, the whole society involved in terms of addressing these issues. And I'm moving to the issue of the potential impact and the situation that this pandemic has put in our society, our region, and the world in terms of the potential impact. And from the very beginning, the main issues of concern related to perinatal health and the COVID-19 has been the prenatal and delivery care. At the very beginning, the question was, is there a possibility of vertical transmission of COVID-19 from the mother to the newborn? The immediate newborn care, because again, at the very beginning, the newborns and mother were separated because being concerned about the possibility of transmitting the virus and the possibility of affecting the newborn. The evidence by now does not show the possibility of vertical transmission from the mother to the baby, but also to sustain the specific requirements and risk for caring newborns, specifically preterm and sick newborn, and also the care at the time of discharge. And sustaining essential services for every newborn has been, as I said, a main concern, and we have been working, and we are still working, and it's necessary to provide at every level, at the national level and in every health service and community, sustaining evidence-based interventions. And which are those interventions? Providing immediate newborn care, providing postnatal care depending on the conditions and the risk of the newborns, and specifically in premature, on preterm or serious ill newborns, we need to sustain the adequate care to provide and to cover the requirements and admission to NICU when it's necessary, and providing safe care in transport and referral of this newborn, because we know that in many countries or in many cities or regions, the health system should readapt the response and refer some human resources to other services. So sustaining the provision of adequate care and specifically sustaining essential interventions. And I would like to stress again, sustaining breastfeeding as one of the most powerful interventions is important within this context. Also providing and strengthening immunization and preventing specific complications. We have learned during this almost a year within this pandemic that you can see these bars that express the proportion of countries that have reported having some severe disruption in specific intervention. And around 50% of the countries have reported disruption of family planning services, antenatal care, postnatal care, specific interventions for preterm newborns. So we need to stress sustaining essential care and reducing the disruption of care and services to these newborns. Essential services maintenance implies prioritizing essential services, and within these essential services, we need to highlight the need of sustaining the care for mothers in order to prevent preterm births and also prematurity birth newborns in order to provide the adequate and required care. Also optimizing the configuration and service delivery platforms, looking for alternative options like community services, telemedicine, etc. Establishing effective patient flow at all levels within the same health facility, but also between health facilities and referral, rapidly distribution of health workforce capacity, and maintaining the confidence of the population. And this is, I think, the most important message in this forum, because it's important to support families and to promote sustaining the care for mothers and newborn in order not to expose and increase the prevalence of prematurity and the complications. Because the concerns are beyond the health services. We know that the impact on poverty levels due to this pandemic, it's real. We are expecting the increase in poverty level in most of our communities. The crisis aggravation of the situation that in most countries and mainly in displaced community, it's a real concern. Also the threats to survival and children's health and the risk for children's safety. And here I would like to include the issue of mental health and household in violence within the household, violence against the mother, the women, and the children. So this implies prioritizing the continuity of child and family-centered services with special focus on equity of access, establishing specific care for vulnerable families and vulnerable children. And again, preterm babies are within this condition, providing practical support to parents and caregivers, developing flyers, information, education materials, even texting through networks, social networks, in order to promote the adequate care and to provide adequate support. And this is an essential contribution of parents and family organization, and the value it's absolutely high in order to contribute to this process, responding to the COVID pandemic and reducing the impact. As I said, it's not only responsibility of the national authorities, it's not only responsibility of the healthcare providers, it's also responsibility of the social networks, social organizations, and parents organizations. So, and these are my final remarks. We are living in the region with high inequity, and more inequity will be seen in the coming years. We need to be aware of the key time, the time of opportunity, and the actors involved in preventing and providing adequate care, to preventing preterm birth and to providing the adequate care. We need to move from the institutional structure and fragmented interventions to a comprehensive interventions within the nurturing care approach that I have mentioned. We need to strengthen the equity lenses, because we are talking about the silent period. The preterm baby, we know that the risk and the possibilities of providing healthy growth and development will depend on our responsibility, and it's the responsibility of all of us, and each one has a role to play. So let's make that every baby count, and thank you for your attention.
Dr. Duran, thank you so much for your presentation, for giving us this big picture and the situation in the Americas. It's so very important, especially during this time. We talk so much about collaboration with healthcare professionals, societies, parents. But here we, as far as we know, in all parent organizations around the world, that NICUs have been shut down to parents in a lot of countries. Here in Canada, we had just new policies of one parent at a time, and just now a lot of units reopened for both parents. And we know through research how babies' outcomes can improve if both parents are present, because there is more kangaroo care, more breastfeeding, less ROP. How we are going to move forward with family-centered care as a simple intervention for better outcomes for babies?
Yes, I think it's a great challenge, and it has to be addressed at the different level. It's important to work at the parents and families level, promoting and establishing networks. It's important to raise the voice with the responsible for the health facilities, but also it's important to reach the authorities and those responsible for policy making, showing the evidence, because the evidence is available. Many times the head of the health, the NICUs and the health facilities are not willing of having the parents around, but we know that, and we have learned that having the parents would be also a support for providing care, because parents, the most important things that parents have are their newborns, so they can contribute with the care providers. So it's important to work together and advocate on that perspective.
Absolutely. We have a question from our live audience. Somebody's joining us from Buenos Aires. She asked, what can you tell about follow-up after an ICU discharge? There is a high disparity in follow-up programs within countries, actually even within a country, because here in Canada, we have a huge disparity. A family is born in a rural, remote area versus in the big centers. So health and education are scarcely linked so as to provide early childhood education. How can we encourage policies about these issues? This is from Lydia from Buenos Aires.
Thank you, Lydia. It's an important question, and I know that in Buenos Aires they have a great experience providing follow-up to preterm newborns, but I also know that we also know that it's not enough. So not only having specialized service providers, follow-up units, it's also about having national guidelines. And this is why we are working together with WHO and the Pan American Health Organization on developing these guidelines that we expect that will be translated into national guidelines that regulate having follow-up units in the different health services and also at the community level, because you don't need high technology to provide follow-up to newborns. Having telemedicine, having the possibility of referral, it's enough. So we need all the experience from colleagues as Dr. Lydia and all the experts having the experience on that perspective.
Absolutely. Dr. Duran, unfortunately, our time is up, but I will bring you back because there's so many more questions and things to be addressed that we really need to work together and, hopefully better outcomes for babies born preterm, but also engage more families and really work on the equity piece because it is so very important in every single country. So, Dr. Duran, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us. We have people from Poland, Buenos Aires, Madrid, and all over Canada. So we are so grateful to have you with us today. And we stay tuned. We'll be back in just a short minutes with Claire Osepchook and Claire Dion Fletcher. They are hospitalist midwives improving Indigenous cultural safety in the NICUs. This is a very important topic for us here in Canada. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and NICUs during November and December. And until the end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate one extra diaper to Canadian ICUs through CPBF. I would like to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And CPBF is a registered charity, and your donations this week will go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, canadianpreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all NICU families. So come, stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you. everyone. Welcome to Preemie Power Week. If you are joining us now, welcome. Today's day 5. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting in 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These educational sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANS, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring you the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. And I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And right now we're going to talk about hospitalist midwives improving Indigenous cultural safety in neonatal intensive care units. This presentation will provide an overview of the role of hospitalist midwives in addressing cultural safety for Indigenous families in neonatal intensive care units of an urban level 3 hospital. Taking a strength-based approach, we will outline the disparities in health outcome in Canada, explore the importance of culture and ceremony in birth and the early postpartum, and provide examples of initiatives taken to improve care for Indigenous families. Joining me here from Toronto, I have Claire Osepchook, who is a registered midwife at 7th Generation Midwives in Toronto, and a hospitalist midwife at Sunnybrook Health Science Center. She's a descendant of settlers from the UK and Ukrainian immigrants. She has an academic background in biochemistry, medical health research, and teaching. Claire is committed to supporting her Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues, clients, and their families. Also joining us is Claire Dion Fletcher, who is also a midwife, a Potawatomi Lenape, and mixed settler registered midwife practice in Toronto, Ontario. Claire is co-chair of the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives and an assistant professor in the midwifery education program at Ryerson University. Claire is dedicated to the growth of Indigenous midwifery in Canada and the expansion of Indigenous midwifery education. Welcome both, Claire. I'm so honored to have you here today to talk about this very, very important topic. We just talked with Dr. Pablo Duran. I know you're watching us about disparities in care, and I'm looking forward to continue this piece of education. How can we educate our healthcare providers on different cultural aspects and how include everyone into the picture? So thank you both.
Great, thank you for having us. So I'm gonna jump right in because I was gonna introduce myself, but I think you covered everything in that intro. Thanks, Fabiana.
Okay, so I will start with the objectives. So the objectives of this presentation is to describe the role of the hospitalist midwives in addressing the cultural safety for Indigenous families in the NICU. And we currently work at a level 3 hospital in downtown Toronto. We're going to review the importance of culture and ceremony in birth and parenting. And we are going to describe the initiatives taken to improve perinatal care for Indigenous families.
So we just wanted to start with a brief description of what we do as registered midwives and a little bit of information. I know some people will be aware of what midwives do in Canada, but just wanted to make sure we all have a good understanding of our role. So in Ontario, midwives are primary healthcare providers during pregnancy, labor, and birth, and for 6 weeks postpartum for both the postpartum person and for the infant. There's three main tenets of midwifery care in Ontario. We believe strongly in continuity of care. So generally that means that our clients meet a small number of midwives, usually about 2 to 4, and one of those midwives is always available for them. We do prenatal care, the same midwives attend the birth, and the same midwives do postpartum care. We also believe strongly in informed choice. We really believe that the best way to access care is for our clients to be in control of their healthcare and in control of what happens to themselves and their bodies. And so informed and choice is really important for us. We facilitate, a lot of people being involved in clients' care, but ultimately the decisions of what happens is up to the client, and we help make recommendations and help them make those choices throughout their healthcare. As midwives in Ontario, we also believe strongly in choice of birthplace. So when you have a midwife, you can have a home birth, you can have a hospital birth, or if you are in a city where there is a birth center, you can also have your baby at a birth center. So those stats there are the percentages of midwifery births that occur in those 3 locations across the province. So I'm going to speak what will seem very briefly because of our time about the role of colonization in health inequities in this country. I wanted to start by saying we're going to be touching on a number of serious issues that affect Indigenous people. It's really important that we acknowledge these issues of pain and violence in the lives of Indigenous people in this country. However, it's also equally important to remember that this is not all Indigenous people are. We also have a lot of joy and love in our lives from our families and our communities, and especially from the resurgence of our culture, our teachings, our knowledge, and our ways of being, which we're also going to speak to as well. So while it's important to acknowledge the racism and health inequities that stem from it, I would also really encourage everybody to understand that this is not all Indigenous people are, and that there is, as I said, lots of love and joy in our life and in our families. And that's really important to remember when providing care to Indigenous people. I think it is crucial as healthcare providers and as advocates and just as everyday Canadians that we have an understanding of the history of and the ongoing process of colonization and how this affects the health and well-being of Indigenous people. So some of the things we're going to talk about are the kind of main things that we see as impacting Indigenous people's different experience in healthcare, and really what makes oftentimes healthcare inaccessible to our Indigenous clients. So these include experiences of racism and discrimination, colonial policies and their institutional interpretations, and poverty and the social determinants of health. So I'm going to just touch really briefly on some of these Canadian colonial policies that impact Indigenous people's health in Canada. So some people may have heard of the Indian Act. It is an act of government that came about in 1876. It is a large act that incorporates many aspects of Indigenous people's lives. So very quickly, some of the things that the Indian Act has enacted upon Indigenous people is a dispossession of land and a disruption in traditional economies, which has a continued legacy today in persisting poverty. It disempowered Indigenous people's identities, especially those of women and children. The government defined who could be considered Indian by the government. It undermined traditional societal structures, which were often matriarchal and or matrilineal. It also resulted in the reserve system, which separated people from their lands. It separated families, and it specifically isolated women and children from their communities. It also resulted in forced relocations. In this country, we have a history of medical experimentation on Indigenous people. Since the Truth and Reconciliation report on residential schools, many stories have surfaced about the inadequate treatment of Indigenous children in residential schools who were used as test subjects for treatments to TB, and reports of unexplained surgeries on patients in hospitals. The legacy of experimentation on Indigenous people, including children, and the intergenerational impacts can still be felt today. We have the legacy of residential schools, the last of which closed in 1996. The sexual, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and cultural abuse that was experienced by generations of Indigenous children who survived residential school has resulted in profound impacts on the physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental health of the survivors, their families, and our communities to this day. It is also important to remember the many, many children who never returned home from residential school. I also wanted to talk about the historic and current child welfare practices that occur in this country. So some people may have heard of something called the 60s scoop, and more recently something that we refer to as the millennial scoop. So the 60s scoop is a period in time in Canada, in Canadian history, in the 60s, as you can imagine, where in one decade, approximately 1 in 3 Indigenous children was apprehended from their families and communities. Children were adopted, usually by non-Indigenous families, by families outside of the country, and often without any records of where the children went or where the children came from. By 1970, Indigenous children accounted for 30 to 40% of children in care, when Indigenous people accounted for less than 4% of the national population. Now, some people may be very surprised by this and think this is a very staggering statistic, which it is, but this is something that did not stop in the 60s. Currently, about 48% of children in care in Canada are Indigenous, while 4.3% of the Canadian population is Indigenous. This is crucial when we're talking about people accessing healthcare, especially new parents whose babies are in the NICU and in hospitals. It's important that we think about this when we're talking about the right to parent our children in safe environments. In many Indigenous communities, there's a lack of access to basic human rights, such as clean water and adequate housing. In this country, there is an over-surveillance of Indigenous people by the justice system, which results in disproportionate amounts of Indigenous men and women in jail and the health effects that goes along with this. We are also experiencing an epidemic of violence against Indigenous women. Indigenous women experience higher rates of spousal and non-spousal violence. We are 8 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be murdered, and we are just as likely to be murdered by a stranger or an acquaintance as we are by an intimate partner. And the last thing I want to touch on is structural racism. So institutions, including healthcare settings, are designed in such a way that does not take into account the experience of Indigenous people, and as such, creates barriers that non-Indigenous people may not even recognize. So we started with this discussion about Canadian colonial policies and their current legacy today because we think this is extremely important history and current practices that really affect Indigenous people's ability to access healthcare and to feel safe in the healthcare system, where I think we can all agree that people should feel safe and cared for in our healthcare system. That is not the case. So one thing that we're asking you to do today is to think about your assumptions about Indigenous people and how this history of assimilation and attempted genocide in this country has affected your own opinions and picture of who Indigenous people are, what we look like, how we access care, and how we parent our children. So the medical community is starting to recognize the various ways that the colonial legacy in Canada contributes to the overall ill health of Aboriginal people compared to non-Aboriginal people. I'm going to just list a few ways we see this, and then Claire is going to go into these things in a little bit more detail, more related to our topic today. So we see increased rates of chronic disease in Indigenous communities, increased rates of dis and differing ability, increased rates of addiction and substance use, increased rates of suicide, and increased rates of infant mortality.
Thanks, Claire. So the next 3 slides show data from a community-driven health survey for Indigenous people led by Indigenous people. Specifically, it was led by 2 of our colleagues at 7th Generation Midwives Toronto and Well Living House. Well Living House is a research center focused on Indigenous health and well-being, led by a group of Indigenous health researchers, health practitioners, and community of grandparents. As Claire mentioned, we know that the impacts of colonization and colonial policies, such as the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s Scoop, and continued exclusion of Indigenous people from the Canadian economy, are reflected in the higher rates of unemployment and lower socioeconomic status. Research has shown that Indigenous people are undercounted by the national census, and that Statistics Canada has significantly underestimated the prevalence of poverty among the urban Indigenous population in Ontario. So this is what led the Our Health Counts health survey. The Our Health Counts in Toronto study found findings that indicate that there were 45,000 to 60,000 Indigenous adults in Toronto. This is 3 to 4 times more than the estimated number by Statistics Canada. So the data from the next 3 slides is from this larger population of Indigenous people in Toronto. The point I want to highlight from this slide is that Indigenous people who participated in this research study reported they wanted to access prenatal care, but 26% of them did not access care at all, or they only accessed it in the 3rd trimester. In comparison to 95% of women in Canada who had their first prenatal visit before 13 weeks. The survey found that people who had experienced discrimination from a healthcare professional were 2.5 times more likely to not access prenatal care at all, or again, only in the 3rd trimester. One of the major barriers to accessing care was reported as a lack of trust in a healthcare provider. Due to care access issues and systemic discrimination, Indigenous parents experience stress, a lack of social support, poverty, and medical conditions, all of which increase the likelihood of having a premature birth. This survey showed that 1 in 5 Indigenous infants in Toronto were born prematurely or before 37 weeks gestation, compared to 8% of the infants in Toronto. This is almost 3 times higher for these Indigenous infants. And Indigenous infants born in Toronto were 2 times more likely to be both small for gestational age and large for gestational age. And a smaller number of Indigenous infants were born in the normal weight category than other infants born in Ontario. As you know, neonatal intensive care units, or NICUs, are equipped to provide specialized care to premature babies and babies born with medical issues. The main reasons babies are admitted to the NICU are low birth weight, prematurity, and respiratory conditions. This slide shows that 1 in 5, or 21% of Indigenous infants in Toronto were admitted to the NICU after birth, compared to 13% of all live births in Ontario. As well, they had a longer stay in the NICU. This is partly due to medical indications, but also because of the stigma around Indigenous people and their parenting abilities, which delayed the discharge of their infants to their homes.
So we know that in Canada, there's an increasing body of evidence that Indigenous people do experience differential treatment and health outcomes than the non-Indigenous population. We need only look at recent news stories to see the way that this manifests in our healthcare system. The important thing to remember that while news stories such as the recent death of Joyce Echawan or the story of Lisi Kloski, the Inuit elder who had to call 911 while she was in the hospital because she was refused water, or the viral video a few summers ago of the apprehension of a baby in BC, often appear as sensational news stories. These are everyday occurrences in the lives of Indigenous people. This isn't happening in other places. This is happening all across Canada in our communities. So we wanted, with that history and a little bit of background about the Indigenous population, we wanted to shift a little bit into talking about some of the things that we do as midwives. So right now in this country, we are actually in a real moment of resurgence of Indigenous midwifery and Indigenous knowledge and practices surrounding birth, and we wanted to talk about that a little bit. I have here on this slide 3 quotes from Indigenous scholars or elders, or both, about the importance of birth pregnancy, birth, and early postpartum in Indigenous communities and to Indigenous families. One of the things that we think is really important to highlight is that as a community and a group of people that has experienced forced assimilation and an attempted genocide, agency of our reproductive choices and lives and ability to parent is obviously extremely crucial. This is particularly important for Indigenous families. So traditionally, Indigenous midwives had very crucial roles in our communities, and Indigenous women's reproduction and families and our control of our families was an explicit site of colonial violence that was meant to disrupt the power of Indigenous women and to disrupt Indigenous worldviews. So this is why knowledge surrounding pregnancy and birth and early parenting is particularly crucial. We know that pregnancy and birth is a time when many clients are deepening their connection to their culture and to their identity, when they seek out teachings and knowledge and ceremonies that ground them in their culture, that can create an environment for their children that celebrates their culture. So that from the moment of birth, which is something that Gaji Cook often talks to us about as Indigenous midwives, babies are born into their culture and feel a connection to this culture and a strong, healthy identity. Building a strong and healthy Indigenous identity can and does begin in pregnancy when women are seeking out care that is culturally safe and grounded in Indigenous knowledge and ceremony. They are surrounding their baby in a positive and strong cultural environment where their families, where our knowledge systems, where our world views, and where our practices are respected and celebrated rather than looked down upon and as a site of violence.
So how do we improve perinatal care for Indigenous families? Well, what we did is we asked them. So we asked them specifically their barriers to accessing healthcare, what supports they needed, and what they wanted. And here were some of the responses. So the families that responded specifically said they wanted family supports. They wanted their family members to be an integral part of the decision-making in their perinatal care around pregnancy, birth, and for their babies. They wanted to be linked with Indigenous parent groups. They wanted to be with other Indigenous parents and talk about their situations. They wanted Indigenous healthcare providers and culturally safe healthcare providers who could not only locate themselves in the healthcare system and in the world, but also someone that they could talk to about anything and not just about pregnancy and birth. They want more breastfeeding and lactation support. And they want to be supported to make their own decisions around their care, which can include choosing their own healthcare provider. They want safe spaces in hospitals to be able to practice cultural traditions and ceremonies. And they want a continuity of care provider throughout their care. Other important things they said that they needed were outreach and cross-agency referrals, services that were closer to home and to transportation, access to funds for urgent material needs, help with childcare, and even stable housing and food security. So you can see how they're not directly asking about care always for themselves in their pregnancy, but actually being supported in every aspect of their life will drastically improve their perinatal experience and their health outcomes for themselves and their babies. So we are 7th Generation Midwives Toronto is the practice where Claire and I work. It was established in 2005 with 3 midwives with admitting privileges at Women's College Hospital in downtown Toronto. SGMT's mandate is to work with and support the urban Indigenous community in Toronto. We believe and are committed to providing midwifery care and Indigenous midwifery care that enables families to reclaim control of birth for themselves. Currently, we are 18 midwives, 9 of whom are Indigenous, plus 2 Indigenous family physicians, and several ongoing special projects that support the Indigenous communities. Hospitalist midwives. So this is a new program running out of SGMT. It started in September 2018. So it's a partnership with 7th Generation Midwives and Sunnybrook's Women and Babies program. There are 4 of us in this specific program. We call it the Indigenous Midwifery Program, and several of these are funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, scattered throughout Ontario. We have 2 hospitalist midwives who primarily work in the hospital. One of us is there more Monday through Friday, daytime hours, and the other one takes a bit more on-call work for urgent situations. And we also have 2 midwives who work in the community. And often we share care with clients, so to be able to provide clients with support in the hospital setting and then in the community as well. So for us as hospitalist midwives, we work throughout the Women and Babies program, but you'll find us primarily in the high-risk clinic. So this is where pregnant patients come when they need to see specialists. So either the MFMs or the maternal fetal medicine or specialist OBs. They might need ultrasounds at every appointment. They might also need to see dietitians, advanced practice nurses, hematologists. And we created an ability for a midwife to also be part of this interdisciplinary team at their prenatal care visits. We also work on the birthing unit, providing labor and birth care. And we provide support for clients who use the high-risk obstetrics day unit or are admitted there for complications in their pregnancy, sometimes for a very long time. And we also support families who have babies that have been admitted to NICUs, who again could be there for short amount of time or very long time. So some of the highlights of our role would be expanding midwifery services in this interdisciplinary team model care. So I previously mentioned if someone's coming in to see a specialist, they don't have to necessarily lose their midwives. So a lot of the people that we see are actually midwifery clients that wanted midwifery care for their pregnancy, birth, and babies, but perhaps due to a medical history or a current medical condition, or maybe a complication in the pregnancy that developed, they need to access a specialist care. So we're able to still provide them with that midwifery care. Again, we have more time to sit with them a little longer, answer their questions, and potentially fill gaps in where they might need care in the community. Another one of our important roles is to increase cultural safe care, particularly for our Indigenous families. So that might mean for me as a settler to facilitate families to practice a cultural ceremony, or it might mean having an Indigenous midwife come in to support them in whatever way. We accept referrals for any patients who access the Women and Babies program at Sunnybrook who are not currently under midwifery care, at least with SGMT, if they could benefit from additional midwifery support, and in particular, Indigenous midwifery. So some referrals come from people who are transferred from out of region for a complication in their pregnancy, and they need to be admitted to hospital for a while. So they've been separated from their families and their communities. Or if they are midwifery clients from another practice, again, being transferred to Sunnybrook for some complication in pregnancy. We can provide additional support for families with social complexities and for families that have child protective services involvement needing extra parenting support. So some of the activities of the midwife hospitalist are, again, providing clinical care for pregnant people that is holistic, culturally safe, and respects Indigenous beliefs and values. We provide health literacy and knowledge translation. We're fortunate, again, to have a bit more time to sit with our clients, review their blood work, look at their ultrasounds, answer any questions they might have about their care plan from the specialists. Try to figure out what they need and how to support them in other aspects of their health. So maybe even things in the community or supports they might need at home. We support our clients to navigate the healthcare system. If there are complications such that you need to see a couple of different healthcare providers, sometimes it can be overwhelming. So we help facilitate that. We support engagement with different healthcare providers, as well as community supports. We provide mental health support and facilitate access to resources. So that could be within lots of the different resources at Sunnybrook, or maybe if clients are wanting support from the Indigenous community, we can help link them up with supports there. We work to advocate to strengthen families and keeping families together. So one example is we can provide that 6 weeks postpartum care for clients who maybe weren't even midwifery clients to begin with, like they only had an OB, to provide extra parenting support for those first 6 weeks of their baby's life. And we facilitate and honor traditional roles, ceremony, rites, and protocols surrounding birth and families. So we have relationships with elders and knowledge keepers in the community. So we can offer, if clients are wanting to speak to someone, to facilitate that visitation. Right now, of course, things have moved virtual, but when restrictions are lessened or visitation is allowed again, we can actually bring elders or knowledge keepers to the hospital for people who may not be able to leave because of their condition. We provide medicines for cultural practices. We find those safe places for people to practice those ceremonies. Sometimes it's in an education room. Sometimes it's in the garden outside the hospital. But we help our clients find those spaces to do that. I already mentioned providing postpartum care in the community for some people who need extra support, and providing them with access to community services. And just having time to sit down and figure out what they need. So why are they missing a prenatal appointment? Is it because they don't have childcare? Are there challenges for transportation, so that they can really access the care that they want to access? So what can you do? What are your calls to action? So I think number one, if you haven't already, you need to read the Truth and Reconciliation Report. You need to make a commitment to look at the impacts that your work has on Canada's Indigenous people, and including both the intended and the unintended impacts of your work. You need to build relationships with the communities in and around where you work, and directly ask your community what they want and how they need to be supported. One of the calls to action specifically states, support innovative and culturally safe models of care dedicated to serving Indigenous infants and families to begin closing those gaps in the healthcare between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Another call to action is for all healthcare providers to take Indigenous cultural safety training. There's an excellent one that is funded by the LHIN in Ontario. There's another excellent one offered in BC and in other provinces and territories. There are many modules and opportunities to take this type of training. These trainings offer a deeper understanding of how to identify systemic racism in healthcare, how you can reflect on your role in this racism in healthcare and try to change it. Another call to action would be to find different ways to support or get involved with different Indigenous and/or midwifery initiatives happening through the perinatal programs. So, for example, support the implementation and scale up of culturally safe, family-centered care models in the NICUs, address barriers for Indigenous parents and families in being with or providing care to their babies who are hospitalized in NICUs, which include helping solve barriers, financial barriers for accommodation, transportation, and food security in childcare. Create dedicated spaces in hospitals and clinics for traditional cultural practices and ceremonies. And link Indigenous families with infants admitted in hospital NICUs with Indigenous perinatal workers and/or midwives for ongoing cultural support. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I just realized I was mute. So I want to thank you, both of you, for this great presentation. And Claire, Dion, Fletcher, thank you for the history lesson. I think this is so very important for us to remember the history, learn about the history. As an immigrant, I didn't know about this piece of history. And I started learning when my son was in grade 3, that came home, talk about residential school. And I asked my husband, who was born and raised in Canada, also son of an immigrant, what is residential school? I never heard of this. He said, me neither. So I think there's a lot of teaching and learning that we have to do as a society. And I'm so grateful that you brought this piece to this presentation, because I think it's crucial for us to understand, first of all, to understand, acknowledge, and then how we will move forward with less racism or no racism at all, because I think that's the goal, to eradicate racism altogether. So I have a question here from a private chat. Canada has a long-lasting experience work with Indigenous population. How is the response from the Indigenous groups regarding prenatal and newborn care? Are traditional midwives involved, and do they work on working together with them? What are the main challenges?
Fabiana, could you just read the beginning of the question again for me?
Canada has a long-lasting experience working with Indigenous population. How is the response from the Indigenous groups regarding prenatal and newborn care?
Claire, do you have any?
Well, I would actually argue that we actually need to improve the healthcare that we provide for Indigenous families, and that, as Claire mentioned, in our history in Canada has been that we've drastically disrespected and have not provided good healthcare to Indigenous people. So I think, as we mentioned, it would be important to actually ask a community, if you're trying to sort of improve the care for a community, what you need to do is to ask them what they want. So there's a quote that's I think relevant, is about nothing for us without us. Again, not Indigenous, but it's really important to basically ask what you need. So that's what we did. Our colleagues and all the excellent workers with the research center actually went out and did that work of asking that 45,000 to 60,000 Indigenous families in Toronto, lots of different aspects of their healthcare actually, so not just prenatal care, to really say, like, what are the barriers? And so I think we have a lot of information of where we can improve things to increase better health outcomes for Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, I think, sorry, if I can just say one thing. I also think that that's one of the reasons why we see, like, we see Indigenous midwifery look so different across the country. So, you know, like the midwives who are working in Northern Quebec and Nunavik, the midwives who are working at Six Nations, us at SGMT in Toronto, midwives who are working in the Northwest Territories, who are working in BC. Our midwifery programs look so different because for us, we really start with our communities and ask and try to find out what our communities need and then go from there. And I think that's a really crucial thing that is really how we're going to be able to address care and better meet the needs of our communities is by talking to our communities and seeing what they need. We can't decide for them what it is that they need or what we think they need.
So we have a comment here from Dr. Duran, from the World Health Organization, who just spoke to us before, said it would be great learning and sharing the experience with other groups who work with Indigenous people in other countries. Absolutely. We have a lot of work to do for sure. And I think we can all learn this together. So Claire, my question to you is, well, both Claire, Dion, Fletcher, now like, okay, a little confused with the Claires. But my question is, big centers, obviously where you are, is highly supportive of your work, and you bringing your cultural traditions into these big hospital units. Are all hospitals open to receive you as a traditional midwife in the units to work with families?
Yeah, I think it really varies. And sorry, there's a bit of feedback there. I think, you know, we've had our experience at our hospital and different, I don't think it has to do with the size of the hospital. I think it depends on like who's in leadership and what the goal of the hospital is, and what like the knowledge of the experience of Indigenous people in healthcare is of the people in the hospital. You know, I've seen from my Indigenous midwifery colleagues them be very well received in the hospital. We get lots of support from doctors and from nurses and from administrative teams. And then there's other hospitals and places in the country where we just don't get that support at all.
So do the change have to start with leadership and then go down the chain, or vice versa? How do we put the pressure from the ground to the top, or is it all the way around?
Personally, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think it's, you know, for big changes to happen, there has to be support in leadership and support from the top. But as like individual care providers, we can do a lot to change how people experience that individual moment, and can really affect people's experience of healthcare. And I think like affect whether they will access healthcare again, right? So one of the things Claire had talked about was like when people have an experience of racism or discrimination in the healthcare setting, or you hear about it from a family member, then that actually prevents people from accessing healthcare later. And that's really important in having good health outcomes.
Okay, so let's talk about the NICU, because I learned a few years ago the role of the grandmother for Indigenous population, and the grandmother is the one who helped to raise the child. So when you look about in the NICU, when you consider the parents to be the mother and the father, or the two mothers, whatever the family unit is, we never include the grandparents. How is that for your culture? How is that in the NICUs from your experience that is happening in the country?
It's so hard, I think, right now with COVID to think about like how our experiences are, just because they've been so affected. And I think that's something that, you know, we obviously want our families to be around us, and our family is very important. And I think it's also important to remember that in Canada, we talk about like Indigenous people and First Nations and Inuit and Métis often as a group, but it's really important to remember the diversity within the Indigenous population, and how our communities have lots of different traditions and knowledge and practices. But I think especially during COVID, one of the important things to think about that as Indigenous people we are also thinking about is protecting our elders, and that yes, we all want our family to be there and be with us, but we also know that protecting our community that already has an increased burden of disease is hard, and sometimes that means not having the people with us who we want in order to protect them from disease. Because in many communities, if COVID comes to our communities, there is very little access to healthcare, and that's something that we need to take really seriously and think closely about, and that we are. I kind of went off on a tangent from your question, but
no, but you absolutely answered the question. But my next question is, when you talk about the midwives in the hospital, you support the mom 6 weeks post birth. So how does that happen in the ICU? Do you take especially this time when the families are isolated, there is no extended family, do you take a little bit of their role?
Claire, I'm leaving that one for you.
I have noticed that in the pandemic, especially when the restrictions were so tight and a lot of pregnant people were, say, on the unit, they couldn't leave because of complications, were anticipating a preterm birth. So lots of anxiety for those people, and they couldn't have a single visitor. And, I'm not sure if I had grandparents alive today, they would be able to virtually visit me or have access to internet or smartphones. My mother has challenges with that. So what we noticed was we had perhaps a lower number of referrals for families during the pandemic, but actually we spent so much more time supporting to them, listening to them, trying to facilitate things. Claire and I were doing FaceTime with a baby in an incubator to a mom up on a really northern reserve every day through Christmas, actually. So this was before the pandemic, but we do a lot of things like that to try to connect people with their families. And we ask everyone to fill out a patient survey, and a bunch of our surveys have said that we helped at least sort of fill a bit of a void of a support person. Of course, we're not a replacement for their family member, but at least to have someone that's visiting them. Even though we also wear the healthcare provider hat, sometimes we just sit and listen to what's going on and what's really stressful. It's not always about reviewing that ultrasound or the next test their baby has to have.
Right. So you mentioned a little bit in your presentation about how we can improve the family support when they are in the ICU. I would like to review that piece because I think that is so important, that message. How can we improve that? Not only in your unit, but in units across Canada.
Well, I think actually our unit does a great job. So forget the pandemic, but prior, family members could visit. The parents just have to sort of bring them in. So we were bringing grandparents in, aunties, uncles. We were supporting cultural practices, finding places for ceremony. So I think we had a great policy, and the NICU in Sunnybrook works really hard, and they recognize how family support is so important. Perhaps not necessarily from an Indigenous perspective, but in general, that support is really, really necessary for families. So I would say if there are more strict visitor policies, again, trying to not include COVID restrictions, is to really recognize that the restriction on visitors is hard. So even that brings me to thinking on the birthing unit. Typical hospital restrictions are you bring 1 or 2 support people. Some of our clients want to bring their whole family, and it's just not allowed in the hospital. So having the option of an out-of-hospital birth, again, so we're not talking about babies that are being born prematurely, but at the birth center, we can accommodate an entire family and any ceremony that they want to do, and that's really important. So even though I think our NICU is great, I'm sure others can improve, and I think our birthing unit policies could improve to really recognize the importance of family in the pregnancy, birth, and postpartum and infant life.
So Claire, Dion, Fletcher, can you tell us a little bit about the ceremonies when the baby is born? Teach us a little bit about the ceremony and how we were keeping those ceremonies alive today in times of COVID.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a difficult question to answer because everybody's going to have different things. So I think, one of the points that you made about the, understanding the importance of extended family and understanding the roles that different family members may have might be different in Indigenous families than in non-Indigenous families, or might just be like different than what you're used to seeing. And I think I can't really speak to specific ceremonies just because there's so much diversity. But really being, I think, open to that and to listening to clients about what they need and asking and like practicing and learning how to do that in a respectful way, right? Is that it's difficult. It's something that we're not always used to doing. And so being able to really talk to any clients or any patients about what it is that they would like, and then figuring out the systems, because sometimes the hospital system isn't set up for those things. And rather than just kind of saying, no, that's not going to work, thinking about like, okay, so what can we do to make it work? And what kind of things can we change to make this available?
Absolutely. Yeah, so moving forward after the NICU discharge and families are home, now we want to have all the voice at the table. We want to have everyone involved in research, in discussions. How can you move forward and improve the experience of Indigenous families in the hospitals? So how do we engage Indigenous people in that piece of the system? Because I feel I sit in a lot of different committees for research, for advisory committees, and I feel there is always this lack of representation. So how can we bring that to the table?
Well, I think it's actually get Indigenous people to those tables. So a lot of hospitals on different committees will want a parent representative, for example. So it would be, if you're trying to provide care in a specific way, again, for any community, you want to bring Indigenous people into it. So I think we need to have more Indigenous healthcare providers. We need to have more Indigenous perinatal support workers. We need to invite people, but again, in a respectful way. So, because we're actually asking them for their time and their experiences. So, it's not about bringing someone in and paying them to talk, but actually like thinking about, well, what is sort of the Indigenous framework around this type of help? So maybe it looks quite different. Maybe it's sharing a meal. Maybe it's getting families together. I don't know, but I think it really, really has to start with asking Indigenous people what they need and asking them if there's challenges to get people there. Well, why? So then, what are you asking them? Why is it not happening? And somewhere you might get lucky to have someone who has the time and resources and energy to say, this is how we can do it better.
Absolutely. Claire, any final thoughts? Claire, Dion, Fletcher?
I think that was a great answer from my colleague Claire. I think also just remember that, the experiences that I talked about in terms of our clients are also like my experiences, right? And our experiences as healthcare providers. And so, though we may have be working in a system and seem to be doing well and flourishing in that system, it's not really our system, and it's not necessarily where we want to be putting our energy. When taking care of our clients is often takes a lot of our time and energy and where our focus is, and just keeping that in mind and thinking about, kind of as Claire said, like what kind of different systems need to be made and how could we alter what we're doing to be more inclusive. Yeah.
Okay, so I would thank thank you both of you for joining us here today. Such a great conversation. I'm sure we have much more to talk about and many more questions, but I'm so grateful for what you share with us today. And I hope a lot of people are taking notes on these lessons from both of you and how can we be more inclusive. Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Fabiana.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for joining us here, either on Facebook or YouTube. I'm very grateful to have your companion today. And we're going to take a short break and come back with Dr. Shoo Lee, talk about the future of neonatology. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and ICUs during November and December. Until the end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate 1 extra diaper to Canadian ICUs through CPBF. And I would like to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. We are a registered charity, and your donations this week will go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, canadianpreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all NICU families. So our next session will start in just a few minutes with Dr. Shoo Lee. Stay with us. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And if you are joining us now, welcome to day 5 of Preemie Power Week. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These educational sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANCE, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring you the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And right now, we're going to talk about the future of neonatology. It's our last session of the Preemie Power Week, and I'm very excited to know what is ahead of us. And joining me here from Edmonton is Dr. Shoo Lee, who is a neonatologist and health economist, professor of pediatrics, obstetrics, and gynecology, and public health. Dr. Shoo Lee had many roles throughout his career, and he's still a clinical senior clinician scientist in the Lunefeld Tenenbaum Research Institute. Dr. Lee received his medical degree from the University of Singapore, completed his pediatric training at the Janeway Children's Hospital in Newfoundland, and neonatal fellowship training at Boston's Children's Hospital, and received his PhD in health policy economics from Harvard University. Dr. Shoo Lee research focuses on improving quality of care, patient outcomes, and healthcare services delivery. He developed family integrated care model as a paradigm of care in the neonatal intensive care unit. Dr. Shoo, thank you so much for joining us here today. Dr. Shoo, can you hear us? I don't hear you.
Hello.
Oh, now we can hear you. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Shoo Lee. We can hear you if you can hear us. Hello, Dr. Shoo? Okay, I think we experienced some technical difficulties. Dr. Shoo Lee going to establish his connection. Oh, there he is. Can you hear us, Dr. Shoo Lee?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, good. All right. You just off for a minute, and good. I'm glad we are back. Well, first of all, thank you, and I want to congratulate Fabiana and the foundation for an amazing job that they have done over the years, and also for this conference, which is really power-packed, and you can see the progress that has been made over the years. So this is wonderful, and I'm pleased to see that it will provide a strong foundation for the future. So Fabiana asked me to talk about the future of neonatology, what it might look like. And so here are some thoughts that I have, and I'm going to share them with you so that you can also think about what perhaps you can do to move neonatology forward in the future. I think one of the most exciting and important things that we have seen in neonatology in recent years is actually the greater involvement of the family. And with iCare, we suddenly brought in the family as partners in care as opposed to visitors in the NICU. And that's a very big step forward. But it's only the start. There's a long way to go ahead. If you think about it, not all our NICUs are actually functioning, even in iCare, at the level that we want them to function at. In other words, we want to make sure that it actually is working well and parents are involved as intimate providers of care, as partners with the NICU team. And they really should be an integral part of the NICU team. And that really hasn't happened in all the units yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Secondly, we have to think about how do we make sure that the physical structures that we have are most conducive to this form of care. I'm not convinced that the single family room, the design that we have now, actually is still the right design. In other words, there's still work to be done. And we have to start thinking about how if the families are going to spend more time in the NICU, how we can make it more functional, more comfortable, and better for them so that they can actually do what they are meant to do in the NICU. In the same way, we have to think about how we can involve them in the way we manage the NICU, and not just in the care of the babies. Because if they are going to be part of the team, surely they can contribute to how the unit is run, is managed, and organized. And so I would very much like to see parents become more involved, even at the administrative level and in the planning levels of all the NICUs. And I think this is something that parents can contribute a great deal to. And the running of the place is not just in the operations, but also in how each person's roles should evolve over time as we begin to learn more about what we can do best from each member of the team that's looking after the baby. Now, the next thing we have to consider is a gentler, kindler approach. The whole point of bringing the family in is not only to provide the increased bonding between the families and the babies and improve care and improve outcomes, but it's also to ensure that we change our approach to neonatal care from one that is very medically oriented and very technology based to one that has like a kinder, gentler face, and also the way in which we approach the baby, the illness, the treatments, and so on. Starting with feeding. For example, in recent years, we have been emphasizing a great deal on human milk feeding. Now, that's very important. Now, how do we ensure that babies are fed in the best way possible using milk rather than intravenous nutrition and so on? Now, that's not to say it's not necessary, but how do we optimize human milk feeding? I think there's still work to be done there. We can probably do fewer tests in the NICU. We can make investigations less invasive. And all these things will help us not just look at how do we bring parents into the NICU, but how do we approach our babies in terms of medical care, nursing care, and so on, with less invasive procedures so that we can actually provide the babies with a gentler environment and a safer environment in which they do not require as many invasive tests and painful procedures and so on. Now, the third point I want to make is that technology has also advanced. And now we have many point-of-care technologies where we can do ultrasounds at the bedside, for example, instead of chest x-rays. We can do different kinds of procedures from ultrasounds of the heart and so on. And many of these technologies can supplant all the invasive kinds of investigations that we did in the past. And so we have to adopt more of these technologies, learn how to use them better, and also this will help to augment the kinder, gentle approach that I was talking about. We should also have a seamless transition from the NICU to home, far more seamless than we have. Now, FiCare has gone a great deal to do that. By bringing the parents in, we can begin to prepare the families better for how to look after their babies when the babies go home. But there's a lot more to be done. For example, when the babies go home, we now have the FiCare Home project that's going on under Dr. Jennifer Young, where we're beginning to look at how can parents support each other and support their babies better at home. And then we have to think about how do we integrate that with the services that we have in the communities so that, in fact, this is seamless as opposed to siloed and separate in different aspects of the care. This would mean that our follow-up units will need to reorientate themselves from just doing assessments to looking at early interventions. And these early interventions should probably focus more on behavioral and learning rather than emphasizing mainly on the physical and the cognitive developments, because those we've been putting a lot of efforts into, but we haven't done nearly the same in behavioral and learning emphasis. And this is actually very important because a great deal of the problems that we see in these babies can actually be headed off if we apply the right kind of behavioral and learning modifications to the babies so that we head off a problem early and don't let it become a problem, because these are many of the preventive things that we can do and see. In the same way, many of the school systems are actually unprepared for premature babies. They deal with all handicapped children the same way, and they think about premature babies as handicapped. Well, that's not always the case. There may be some premature babies who are handicapped, but many premature babies are just a little slow compared to their term counterparts. And therefore, we cannot treat them the same way. And increasing the school system's understanding of and how to deal with premature babies is a very important issue. It is something that we have a lot of work to do on. And it cannot be done through the Ministry of Health alone. This is something that we have to work with the Education Ministry, with the educational personnel, so that they begin to understand our babies better. And they know how to help our babies develop to the best of their capacity. And, when I speak to parents, many parents tell me how difficult a time it is they have when the children start going to school, that they have to fight so hard to get the right services for their babies. And that precisely speaks to what this problem is. And I think that a group of parents and professionals working together to try and change this will be very important for the future. Now, neonatology is also going to be incorporating many sorts of new developments in medicine in the future. We are already starting to see, for example, the advent of fetal surgery and fetal therapy. For example, in babies suspended bifida, we no longer do the surgeries after the baby is born. And whenever possible, we try to do the surgeries before the baby is born. So when the baby is born, the defect is already been dealt with. The wound is healed, and the babies can begin to function well and much better than if the surgery had to be done after the baby is born. In the same way, for premature babies, we're going to see many of these things happen. We are now into the era of not only fetal surgery, but very soon it will be gene therapy. It will be the application of genomics like CRISPR and so on. And these have all got tremendous potential, but also tremendous harm. And so we have to be very cognizant about how we embrace all these new technologies and how we can develop these further so that, in fact, our babies can benefit the best from them. And in this journey, I would advocate that parents need to play an equal, if not leading role in how we embrace all these technologies so that we do it right and not embrace the technologies for the technology's sake, but ensure that it is for the best outcomes for our babies and our families. Now, in the process of doing this, what you're also seeing is that as treatments come earlier and earlier into gene therapy, into fetal therapy, and so on, the neonatologists and the obstetricians really need to be working more closely together. And I think that, in fact, the field of neonatal medicine and of obstetric medicine need to come closer together and potentially even merge to solve this problem better for our babies. And this is something that our professionals will have to have a great deal of foresight and a great deal of imagination to see how they can do this better. I think to just stick to the old ways of doing this, where everything that happens in the womb is one thing, and then after the baby is born, you hand to the neonatologist, that's probably going to be gone. We need to start thinking about the continuum of pregnancy, from the time the baby is conceived or even before, up to the time the baby is delivered and beyond, as one continuous spectrum, so that the care provided is not segmented, but is in fact continuous. Now, when we think about that, we should also be thinking about how we evolve neonatology. In other words, neonatology right now is a subspecialty, where in fact neonatologists are trained first as pediatricians, and then they subspecialize in the care of the newborn baby as neonatologists. In fact, we should probably change that so that neonatology is now a generalist specialty. And the subspecialties need to be these subspecialists, need to be specialists in particular areas of neonatal care, whether it's neurology or cardiology or gene therapy, etc., so that we can, in fact, develop people with the best expertise to look after our babies. So all these are huge changes to come. And these are just some of my own thoughts, but I'm sure that many other experts will have many other thoughts. And if we start to put our minds together to think about how we do all these things for the sake of our babies and how we can make them better and our families better and more comfortable, I think we will have a bright future ahead. So I'm going to stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us here today and to share your thoughts, how you're moving forward with neonatology. And I know you're a big advocate for families engagement, family integrated care. I feel like I'm a product of family integrated care, that I'm doing the work that I do now because I was involved in the FICARE study in 2012. My son was at Sinai. So now you know what's happening with family engagement in the ICUs across Canada, limitations of access to the units, and perhaps in many units still today in Canada, only one parent coming to the unit. So how do you see this family approach moving forward after the pandemic? Dr. Lee, can you hear me? I don't think his audio.
I think our connection is not very stable, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. Yes, I did hear your question. I think that, first of all, we need to ensure that all the NICUs embrace the concept of FICARE better. So the first thing we have to do is to set some standards about what FICARE actually means, because everybody says they're doing FICARE. But whether they're actually doing FICARE the way it should be done is open to question. And if you go around the different NICUs, you will see that they're done quite differently. So I think they have to understand what they should be doing. And we probably need more interaction between the units so that some units can go to others where it's done better to see how it's done and say, we can change that. And that should be not just the professionals visiting, but it probably should be parents going to another unit and saying, how is it that they are doing better than we are in this area? And how can we?
Sorry, Dr. Shoo, we lost you for a minute. Yeah, I don't think we lost Dr. Shoo Lee. So I'm going to wrap it up here today. I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation today and to join this conversation the entire week of Preemie Power Week. It was a very special week for us here at CPBF as we mark World Prematurity Day. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and NICUs during November and December. And until the end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate one extra diaper to Canadian NICUs through the CPBF. And I would also like to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And I want to thank all our team here at CPBF for putting this week together for all of us. And just as a reminder, we are a registered charity, and your donations this week we go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, CanadianPreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And as we wrap up Preemie Power Week, I would like to thank all healthcare professionals who work in the field of neonatology. As a parent-led organization, we want to acknowledge your hard work, your passion, your sacrifices, your dedication to improve the outcomes of babies born too soon and to improve parent experiences during a very difficult time. We have come a long way in neonatology, and as you just heard from Dr. Shoo Lee, we still have ways to go. And as I reflect on the change in the ICU since the beginning of the pandemic, I also reflect on the conversations during this Preemie Power Week. It becomes very evident that our collaboration as parents and clinicians and researchers is essential to move forward, to bring different perspectives and systemic changes, so all babies and families have the same opportunity, no matter where they are. And to all NICU families, current and past, CPBF wants you to know that you are not alone. And rest assured that we will continue to be your voice and support you every step of the way. So stay well, everyone. Thank you for joining us from all over the world. We are very grateful that the pandemic really brought us closer together from all corners of this planet. And I will be back every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So stay well, everyone. Thank you.